My father looked me in the eyes, and handed me over like I was nothing more than a debt receipt. I was 19 years old. And the man who took me didn't even glance at my face. The night they sold me, it was raining. Not the gentle kind that softens the earth and coaxes things to grow. The kind that falls in sheets off thatched rooftops and turns the village road into black mud that swallows your boots whole. The kind of rain that feels like a judgment. I remember the tallow candles. 3 of them, burning low on the mantelpiece of our front room, the wax pooled and weeping, the flames bending every time the draft crept through the gaps in our walls. We had never been wealthy enough to seal them properly. We had never been wealthy enough for most things. Outside, beyond our crooked iron gate, 2 black carriages waited. Enormous. Lacquered. The kind that belonged to people who did not travel, who arrived. The horses stood motionless in the downpour, dark as ink, breath rising from their nostrils in pale clouds. No crest on the carriage doors. These people had no need to announce themselves. Everyone already knew who they were. My father stood at the threshold in his Sunday coat, the one with the fraying cuffs he thought no one noticed. He was holding a folded letter. The debt agreement. My name was somewhere inside it, written in somebody else's hand, in ink that had long since dried. "It is only 3 years," he said. He said it quietly. The way men say things they have already buried. 3 years. As though time were simple. As though 3 years taken from a girl of 19 was a small wound that would close on its own and leave no mark. I had never been further than the market town, 6 miles east. I had a small sacred book with my mother's name pressed inside the cover. A wool cloak, mended at the hem. A tin of dried lavender I kept beneath my pillow because it was the only softness left in our house since she had gone. These were the things I carried. The man they were surrendering me to stepped down from the lead carriage just once, long enough for his boots to meet the cobblestones, long enough for his gaze to move across the yard. The gate. The house. My father's outstretched hand holding the letter. And then, past me. Through me. As though I were simply part of the transaction's furniture. His man collected my bundle from the doorstep. The letter exchanged hands. A nod, brief, cold, final. And just like that, I was a debt, discharged. But there is something they do not teach you about girls raised in houses where the candles burn down to nothing and nobody replaces them. We learn to see in the dark. We learn to endure what was never meant to be endured, and we learn to remember every face that looked through us like we were made of glass. Because what my father did not know, what that cold, carriage-riding, stone-faced man did not know, was that by the time he finally looked at me, truly looked, it would already be too late. For both of us. You want to know how a father ends up selling his own daughter? It does not happen all at once. That is the thing nobody tells you. It happens in pieces. Small surrenders. 1 borrowed coin becoming 10, becoming 100, becoming a number so large it stops feeling like money and starts feeling like a hole in the earth that just keeps swallowing everything you throw into it. My father was not a wicked man. I used to believe that mattered. He was simply a weak one. And in this world, in this region, weakness has a creditor. And that creditor has a name. The Ironblood Pack. If you have heard of them, and everyone has heard of them, then you already know that borrowing from them is not like borrowing from a merchant or a moneylender. A merchant takes your furniture when you cannot pay. A moneylender takes your land. The Ironblood Pack takes something else entirely. They are the oldest pack in the region. The most powerful. The most feared. They do not advertise their nature to outsiders, but in villages like ours, the truth moves through generations like a warning passed from mother to daughter at the hearth. They are not fully human. They have never been fully human. And their alpha, the one they call Kael Ironblood, is the kind of man that other powerful men cross the street to avoid. My father had borrowed from them 3 years prior. A quiet arrangement, he'd called it. A bridge loan, he'd said, just until the harvest turned. Just until the trade routes reopened. Just until became never. And the morning the Ironblood enforcer arrived at our gate, a broad, gray-eyed man in a dark riding coat who smiled the way people smile when they already know how the conversation ends, my father's face told me everything before a single word was spoken. The arrangement was simple. 1 daughter. 3 years of service to the Ironblood Estate. All debts erased upon completion. Simple. My stepmother did not even let the silence breathe. Selene, she said. Just that. Just my name, offered up like it cost her nothing. Like she hadn't even needed to think about it, because she hadn't. I understood in that moment that she had thought about it long before the enforcer ever arrived. Had perhaps been thinking about it since the day she first realized the debt was unsalvageable and there were 2 daughters in this house and only one of them was hers. Across the room, my stepsister Mira stood by the window. She was crying. Soft, pretty tears that caught the candlelight perfectly. She reached out and took my hand and whispered, her voice so full of sorrow you might almost believe it. I am so sorry, Selene. I am so sorry. Her other hand was pressed flat against the wall behind her. Holding herself in place. Holding herself safe. I looked at her face, really looked, and I saw it. The thing beneath the tears. The exhale she hadn't quite managed to hide. The relief, warm and private, moving through her like sunlight. I did not say a word. I went upstairs. I packed my bundle. And I told myself, standing in that small cold room for the last time, running my fingers over my mother's sacred book. I told myself that I would remember this. Every detail of it. The candlelight, the rain, the sound of my name in my stepmother's mouth like something she was discarding. I would remember. The Ironblood Estate was 3 hours by carriage through the forest road. I spent the journey watching the trees through the small carriage window, their bare branches reaching across the gray sky like hands that couldn't quite close around anything. The enforcer sat opposite me and said nothing. I was grateful for that. I had nothing left in me for conversation. I had prepared myself for cruelty. I had told myself. They will be cold, they will be harsh, they will make every day a reminder of what you are here and why. I had braced for it. Built myself into something solid on that carriage ride, bone and will and nothing else. What I had not prepared for was the indifference. The estate rose out of the tree line like something that had always been there and always would be. Stone and iron and height, windows that caught no warmth, gates that opened without a sound because they were maintained by people paid to make sure nothing was ever out of place. It was not a home. It was a statement. I was handed down from the carriage by no one in particular and walked through a side entrance, not the main doors, I noted, never the main doors, and delivered to a woman named Mrs. Calloway. The head housekeeper. She looked at me the way you look at a new piece of kitchen equipment. Assessing. Briefly. You'll take the east corridor room. You'll be up before the house. You'll speak when spoken to and work until told to stop. No cruelty in it. No warmth either. Just efficiency. Alpha Kael did not come to meet me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? I was not a guest. I was not a person, in the way that mattered here. I was an account. Settled and filed. I was shown to my room. Small, stone-walled, a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the kitchen yard, and I set my bundle down and stood very still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the estate moving around me. Footsteps. Low voices. The distant clang of something metal in the kitchen below. And then, through the thin wall, I heard them. 2 pack members in the corridor. Young men, from the sound of their voices. Laughing. Did you see her? The debt girl. Barely. She's nothing, is she? Couldn't even afford a real offering. Old Voss must be desperate. More laughter. Fading down the corridor. I stood at my window and looked out at the kitchen yard. The mud. The gray sky. The stone walls that went up and offered nothing back. And something inside me, something that had been bending since my stepmother said my name, since my stepsister's hand pressed flat against the wall, went very, very still. And then it hardened. I will not break, I told myself. Not here. Not for them. Not for any of them. I saw him on the third day. I had not been looking. I want to be clear about that. I was carrying a stack of pressed linens down the main corridor, a task I had been assigned because Mrs. Calloway had decided I was precise enough to be trusted with the good household things, and I was watching my feet on the stone floor, watching the way the torchlight moved, thinking about nothing except the weight in my arms and the ache in my shoulders. And then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. And he walked through it. I knew who he was before anyone told me. You simply knew. The way you know when the weather is about to break, something in the air changes, something in the room rearranges itself around him without being asked. Kael Ironblood. He was taller than I had imagined. Broader. He wore no riding coat. Just a dark shirt, sleeves turned to the forearm, and there was a scar that ran from his jaw down the side of his throat that he made no effort to conceal. His face was the kind of face that had stopped being young a long time ago, not from age but from whatever it costs to be what he was, the weight of a pack, of a name, of all that power worn like armor from the inside out. He was walking with purpose. Looking ahead. Papers in one hand, some matter of estate business already commanding his attention. He was not going to see me. I pressed myself slightly to the side of the corridor. Instinct, the same instinct that made small creatures still themselves when something large moved through their world, and I watched him come closer and I thought, he still won't look. He never looks. I am furniture to him. I am a line in a ledger. And then. He stopped. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just. A fraction. A pause so brief you might have missed it if you weren't watching as closely as I was watching. His gaze moved. Not to my face. Just, near me. The way a man pauses when something at the edge of his attention catches, just for a moment, before he decides it is nothing and moves on. He moved on. The corridor was empty again. The torches burned the same as before. The linens were still in my arms. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have. And I told myself, firmly, clearly, with the full conviction of a girl who had already lost enough. I hate him. He did not acknowledge me. He would not acknowledge me. I was the debt girl, the East Corridor room, the nothing that two-pack men laughed about through thin walls. I hated him. That is what I told myself. But the narration, the honest part, the part that lives beneath the story we tell ourselves to survive. That part knew something different had just happened. That part was already afraid of what it knew. I learned quickly that survival in a place like Ironblood Estate was not about strength. It was about stillness. About becoming the kind of person that a room forgets is present, so that the room, eventually, says everything in front of you. Within the first week, I learned the estate's rhythms the way you learn a language you were never taught but always somehow understood. I learned which floorboards in the East Wing announced themselves underfoot and which stayed silent. I learned that the pack assembled in the Great Hall every morning before dawn, not for ceremony, but for order, for the simple ritual of knowing who was present and who was not. I learned that Mrs. Calloway kept the household accounts in a green ledger behind the kitchen pantry door, and that she checked it every Sunday evening with the particular anxiety of someone who had been blamed for other people's mistakes before. I learned, and I said nothing, and I watched. And what I watched most carefully, because in a house like this, the most dangerous things are always the ones closest to power, was Lyra Ashvane. I had heard the name before I ever saw the face. Spoken in the way that names attached to important people are always spoken, with a particular quality of careful neutrality, the kind that means everyone in the room has an opinion they have decided not to share. She arrived on a Tuesday, by private carriage, with 3 attendants and more trunks than our entire household had owned. Kael's betrothed. She was beautiful the way certain winter mornings are beautiful, sharp, pale, utterly without warmth. Dark hair dressed high. A jaw that could cut glass. She moved through the estate as though she had already inherited it, which, I supposed, was the point. She noticed me on the second day of her visit. I was carrying ash from the upper hearths, which is unglamorous work under any circumstances, and she passed me in the corridor with two of her attendants, and she stopped. Looked at me the way you look at something that has appeared in a place it does not belong. You, she said. What is your name? Selene, my lady. A pause. Something moved behind her eyes, quick and cold, like a fish turning beneath dark water. The dead girl, she said. Not cruelly. That was the particular genius of Lyra Ashvane. She did not need cruelty. She simply said the true thing in the tone of someone who found truth mildly distasteful, and let it do its work. After that, the small miseries began. My linens reassigned to the roughest tasks. My meals timed to arrive when the kitchen was at its coldest. Twice, her attendants delivered instructions to Mrs. Calloway that contradicted my own, and when the conflict arose, the resolution was never in my favor. Nothing that could be named. Nothing that could be brought before anyone. Just pressure. Steady and precise. The kind of pressure that is designed not to break you openly but to remind you, every single day, that you are breakable. What puzzled me, what I turned over in my mind during the long, quiet hours of evening work, was the why of it. I was nothing here. I was the East Corridor room. The dead girl. The line in a ledger. Why did Lyra Ashvane, engaged to the most powerful alpha in the region, with every advantage this world offered laid at her feet like a carpet? Why did she look at me like I was a threat? I did not have the answer yet. But I was learning to trust the questions. It was the land charter that changed everything. I had been in the estate 6 weeks when I first discovered the error, purely by accident, the way most consequential things are discovered. I had been tasked with organizing a cabinet of old estate documents, a job assigned to me because it was tedious and no one else wanted it, and because Mrs. Calloway had decided that my handwriting was acceptable and my sense of order was not. The land charter for the Northern Territory was misfiled. More than misfiled. It had been copied incorrectly, a transcription error in the boundary clause that, if submitted to the regional council as written, would legally surrender 300 acres of Ironblood land to a neighboring estate. The submission deadline was 4 days away. I sat with it for a long moment. I want you to understand something about who I was at this point. I was the debt girl. I was nobody. The correct thing, the safe thing, was to bring it to Mrs. Calloway, who would bring it to the estate steward, who would bring it to whoever handled these matters, and I would return to my linens and my ash pails and my careful invisibility. I had taught myself pack law from the estate's own library, reading in the hours before dawn when the candles were low and no one was watching, not out of ambition, but out of the same instinct that made me learn which floorboards were silent. Knowledge was the only currency available to me. I had been collecting it quietly for weeks. I corrected the document myself. Carefully. Precisely. Recopied the boundary clause in full, matched the original hand as closely as I was able, and refiled it in the correct cabinet. I told no one. Kael found out within 48 hours. I was in the East Corridor, of course I was always in the East Corridor, when Mrs. Calloway appeared with the particular expression of someone delivering news they do not fully understand but find alarming. The Alpha will see you, she said. His study was at the top of the house. North-facing. The kind of room that received no afternoon light by design, I suspected, a room built for work rather than comfort, for clarity rather than warmth. Maps on the walls. Ledgers on the desk. A fire that heated the room without softening it. He was standing when I entered. That surprised me. I had expected him seated, the deliberate architecture of power, the seated authority and the standing supplicant. Instead he was at the window, the corrected charter open in his hands, and he turned when I came in and looked at me with those unreadable dark eyes and said nothing for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it needed to. Then. Explain this. Not, thank you. Not, how did you notice? Not even, sit down. Just, explain this. Like an interrogation. Like I had done something that required accounting for rather than something that had saved his estate a significant loss. I felt the flare of it, the heat of injustice, quick and bright in my chest. I let it pass. The boundary clause in the original copy contained a transcription error, I said. The eastern marker was recorded 12 degrees off true. At submission it would have legally conceded the Greywood Ridge parcels to the Harwick estate. A silence. You read the land charter. I organized the cabinet. I read everything in it. You understand Pack territorial law. I understand enough. He set the charter down on the desk. Slowly. His eyes had not left my face, and there was something in them now that had not been there before, not warmth, not softness, but something sharper than indifference. Something that was paying attention in a way that indifference does not. Where did you learn it? Your library, I said. The hours before dawn are very quiet. Another silence. Longer. And then, almost to himself, like the thought had arrived without permission. You are not what I expected. I held his gaze for exactly one breath. I never am, I said. And I walked out. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I want to tell you that walking out of Kael Ironblood study felt like winning something. What it actually felt like was dangerous. Because I had gone in there planning to be invisible, and I had walked out having been seen. And I was no longer entirely sure which one frightened me more. Lyra moved against me 3 days later. In hindsight, I should have anticipated it. I had been seen by Kael in a way that could not be unseen, and Lyra Ashvane was a woman who noticed everything, particularly things that threatened the careful architecture of her position. I came back to my room after the evening meal to find Mrs. Calloway already there. And 2 of Lyra's attendants. And, laid out across my narrow bed with the particular theatrical precision of a scene that has been arranged rather than discovered, 3 pieces of jewelry. A pearl brooch. A gold chain. A garnet ring I recognized immediately, because Lyra had worn it at dinner 2 nights previous and made a small, visible performance of admiring it at the table. These were found in your quarters, Mrs. Calloway said. Her voice was carefully flat. She did not look pleased. But she did not look surprised, which told me more than she intended. By the time I reached the Great Hall, the accusation was already assembled. The pack had gathered, not all of them, but enough. Senior members. Enforcers. Several of Lyra's social allies, arranged with the casual precision of people who knew exactly where to stand. And Lyra herself, at the center of it, wearing distress the way she wore everything, impeccably. I walked in and every eye found me at once. I want to tell you I was not afraid. That would be a lie. Fear moved through me like cold water, fast, full, and then gone, because I did not have the luxury of letting it stay. I lifted my chin. Whatever came next, they would not see me flinch. Lyra's account was elegant. Measured. The missing pieces had been noticed that morning, a search conducted, my room the only one not under lock. The implication being that I, as the debt girl, as the outsider, as the one who did not belong here by choice or blood, was the obvious conclusion. Her voice carried just enough tremor to suggest personal hurt rather than cold strategy. It was, I had to admit, a masterful performance. The pack murmured. Heads turned toward the estate steward, who was already reaching for the punishment ledger. Because in this world, accusations of theft against pack property had consequences that were swift and physical and permanent. And then the door opened. Kael walked in. He had not been summoned, or perhaps he had, I didn't know. He took in the room in a single sweep, the gathering, the jewelry laid on a cloth before the steward's table, Lyra at the center, me standing alone opposite, and his face gave nothing away. He crossed the room. Examined the jewelry without touching it. Read the steward's preliminary notes. Asked 2 questions in a low voice I could not hear from where I stood. The silence in that hall was the heaviest thing I have ever stood inside. And then Kael straightened. Turned to face the room. The accusation is dismissed, he said. 3 words. Quiet. Absolute. The room did not move. Lyra's composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, a hairline fracture in the perfect surface. Kael, the evidence is insufficient, he said. He did not look at her when he said it. And the method of its discovery is irregular. A pause that landed like a closed door. We will not pursue this further. He left the hall without another word. The pack dispersed in the particular uncomfortable silence of people who have witnessed something they will discuss in private for a very long time. Lyra looked at me once before she left. Just once. The expression on her face was not anger I could have understood. It was something colder. Something that had just reclassified me from inconvenience to enemy. I stood in the emptying hall and tried to understand what had just happened. Kael Ironblood, who had not acknowledged my existence for 6 weeks, who had summoned me like a suspect and interrogated me like a stranger, had just stood in front of his entire pack and chosen to believe me. The debt girl. The East Corridor room. The line in the ledger. I did not know what to do with that. I did not have a place to put it. So I folded it away, deep and careful, and I went back to work. But I did not forget it. I have never been able to forget the things that surprise me. I found him by accident. 3 nights after the haul. I could not sleep. This had become usual, the way that difficult things become usual when you live with them long enough, and I had taken to walking the outer corridor that ran along the estate's eastern wall, where a series of narrow windows looked out over the grounds. The cold air through the gaps was unpleasant, but it was real, and real was what I needed in the hours when everything else felt precarious. He was at the far end of the grounds, near the old stone wall that marked the estate's boundary with the forest beyond. Standing alone, no coat despite the cold, hands braced against the top of the wall and his head dropped forward, not looking at anything. Just, bearing something. The particular posture of a person who has waited until they believe no one could see them before allowing themselves to stop holding everything up. I should have turned back immediately. I know that. I knew it then. I stayed. Not out of curiosity, or not only. There was something in the sight of him that I had not been prepared for. The Kael Ironblood I had assembled in my mind from 6 weeks of careful observation was made of certainty and command and the kind of authority that seems to require no maintenance. The man at the wall was made of something else entirely. He was exhausted. Not physically. Something deeper. The kind of tired that accumulates in a person who has been responsible for everything and everyone for too long, who has made every hard decision and carried every consequence, and who has no one, not truly, not in the way that matters, to set it down with. I understood that kind of tired. I had lived in its neighborhood my whole life. I must have made some small sound, a shift of weight, a breath, because his head came up. He did not turn immediately. And when he spoke, his voice was entirely level, as though he had known I was there all along and had simply been waiting for me to announce myself. Why are you still awake? I considered leaving without answering. Decided against it. The same reason you are, I imagine, I said. A pause. Then he turned. In the moonlight his face was different from how it was inside, less guarded, somehow. Or perhaps just differently guarded. Like a door that was still closed but had been moved slightly on its hinges. Come here, then, he said. Not an order. Not quite an invitation. Something in between. I walked to the wall and stood beside him, and we looked out at the forest together, and neither of us spoke for a while, and it was, not comfortable, exactly. But not uncomfortable either. The particular quality of silence between 2 people who are both accustomed to being alone and have not yet decided what to do about finding themselves otherwise. He spoke first. Not about the charter. Not about the hull. He talked about the forest, about the Northern Territory, the land I had inadvertently saved, what it meant to the pack, what it had meant to his father before him. He spoke like a man who rarely spoke about things that mattered and was doing so now with the careful precision of someone who had not quite made the decision to stop. I listened. And then I talked, not about myself, not about the debt or the carriage or the East Corridor room. About something small. About the library at dawn. About the particular quality of silence in a house before it wakes. He listened. We stayed there perhaps 20 minutes. Perhaps longer. When the cold became serious enough to insist upon itself, I stepped back from the wall. "Good night," I said. He looked at me with those dark, unreadable eyes. And in them, for just a moment, something open. Something that did not quite have a name yet but was beginning, I thought, to search for one. "Good night, Selene," he said. It was the first time he had used my name. I walked back to the East Corridor and I lay down on my narrow bed and I stared at the stone ceiling and I told myself, very firmly, very clearly. Do not. Just, do not. The winter gala came at the turn of the season. Every year, Ironblood Estate opened its great hall to the regional families of standing, landowners, pack allies, merchants of sufficient consequence. It was diplomacy dressed as celebration. An opportunity for Kael to be seen, for alliances to be maintained, for the social architecture of the region to be reinforced over candlelight and good wine. I had been assigned to the serving staff for the evening. Which meant I would be present and invisible simultaneously, the ideal conditions, I had come to understand, for learning things. I did not expect to see my father's carriage among those pulling through the gate. I should have. In retrospect, it made every kind of sense. My father was a regional merchant, diminished, yes, but still nominally present in the circles that received such invitations. And Mira, my stepsister, always climbing, always positioning, had apparently spent the months since my departure attaching herself to the social orbit of a pack beta named Dorian Vass, which would explain the invitation. I saw her before she saw me. She was descending from the carriage in a new dress, deep blue, well-made, the kind of thing that required both money and intention. And she was laughing at something Dorian Vass had said, her hand light on his offered arm, performing effortless charm with the fluency of someone who had been practicing it since childhood. Then she looked up and saw me. The laugh stopped. Not dramatically. It simply ceased, mid-breath, like a candle cupped by a hand. She recovered quickly, because Mira had always been quick, but I had been watching people's faces for months with the focused attention of someone whose safety depended on reading them accurately, and I saw everything in that half-second before the recovery. Shock. And something beneath the shock that was more complicated. I had changed. I knew it without vanity. 6 months in a place like Ironblood Estate. The early hours, the hard work, the constant sharpening of observation and instinct in quiet endurance, it does something to a person. Whatever softness the old life had left in me had been replaced by something steadier. Something that stood differently. Myra's eyes moved over me and I watched her reassemble her expression into something warm and sisterly, and I thought, she's going to cross the room. She's going to embrace me. She's going to perform reunion. I looked away first. Picked up my tray. Moved into the hall. The evening unfolded the way these evenings do, all candlelight and careful conversation and the undercurrent of people calculating one another's worth in real time. I moved through it, present and unnoticed, refilling glasses and observing. And then, across the hall, I felt it. The particular sensation of being watched. I turned, and found Kael. He was standing with a group of senior pack members, mid-conversation, doing nothing at all remarkable. But his eyes were across the room. Across the hall. On me. Not a long look. Not dramatic. Just, a moment of attention, quiet and direct, before he returned to his conversation as though nothing had happened. It was nothing. It was barely anything. But across the hall, I saw Myra's face. She had been watching me. And she had seen it. The look. That brief, unremarkable, entirely unannounced look, and her expression did something I had not seen it do before. The calculation that moved across her face was slow and thorough and cold. She was not looking at me the way she had at our gate in the rain, whispering "I'm so sorry" with her hand pressed flat against the wall in relief. She was looking at me the way she looked at things she wanted, and had not yet figured out how to take. It began so gradually that I almost did not notice it was happening. That is the particular cruelty of Myra's kind of damage. She did not come at you directly. She never had. She worked the way water works on stone, patient, consistent, invisible until the erosion was already done. The first sign was small. Kael did not come to the library corridor that Thursday morning. We had not made an arrangement, nothing so formal, nothing so declared. But there had developed, over the preceding weeks, a quiet pattern. An overlap of hours. A wordless agreement to occupy the same space at the same dawn time, reading separately, saying little, existing in that particular companionable silence that neither of us had named because naming it would have required us to decide what it was. He did not come. I told myself it meant nothing. He was the alpha of a powerful pack. He had responsibilities that dwarfed the significance of an unspoken Thursday morning arrangement with a debt servant. I returned to my book and my candle and the grey pre-dawn light, and I told myself it meant nothing. The second sign was harder to dismiss. 2 days later, I passed him in the main corridor, the same corridor where he had paused, just once, on my third day in the estate, and he walked past me without stopping. Without the fraction of a pause. Eyes ahead, jaw set, papers in hand, and the particular quality of deliberate non-acknowledgement that is entirely different from simple not noticing. He had noticed. He had chosen not to stop. I stood in the corridor after he had gone, and I ran back through everything, every conversation, every evening at the wall, every quiet moment in the library dawn, searching for what I had done. What I had said. Where I had misjudged, overstepped, presumed too much upon a kindness that had never been offered formally and could therefore be withdrawn without explanation. I found nothing. Which was almost worse. By the end of the week, the distance was unmistakable. Summoned for a household matter, he addressed me with the precise, uninflected courtesy of someone speaking to a stranger. The warmth, or whatever that careful, guarded thing between us had been, was simply gone. Excised cleanly. A door not just closed but locked. I did not understand it. And not understanding it, not being able to name the wound or locate its source, made it hurt in a way I was entirely unprepared for. Because somewhere between the land charter and the stone wall and the Thursday mornings and the first time he said my name, I had stopped hating Kael Ironblood. I had stopped hating him and started something far more inconvenient. And now he was looking through me again, and I had no idea why, and I was standing in the east corridor with the particular quiet devastation of someone who has lost a thing they never officially had. It was Mrs. Calloway who gave me the first thread to pull. She mentioned, in passing, with the careful neutrality of a woman who chose her words precisely, that Miss Mira Voss had called upon the estate twice in the past week. Private audiences. At the Alpha's request, she had been told. At the Alpha's request. I sat with that for a very long time. And then I started to pay attention in a different direction. What Mira had done was elegant, I will give her that. She had not fabricated wildly. Wild fabrications collapse under examination. What she had constructed was something far more durable. A careful architecture of half-truths, of genuine details reframed, of my own words and actions described accurately but filtered through a lens of malice until they resembled something entirely different. She had given Kael letters. Letters purportedly written in my hand, the handwriting close enough to mine to be convincing to someone who had seen it only briefly, detailing a correspondence with a rival pack. Suggesting that my presence in Ironblood Estate was not the result of a dead arrangement but of deliberate infiltration. That my interest in the pack's documents and laws and rhythms was not survival instinct but intelligence gathering. That everything I had done, the charter, the library, the dawn mornings, the wall at night, was calculated. Strategic. A long performance. She had dressed the lie in just enough truth to make it breathe. And Kael. Kael, who had been taught by a lifetime of power that trust was a vulnerability and betrayal was a pattern, had looked at those letters and chosen the story that confirmed what he already knew how to believe. I did not know any of this yet. I only knew that he had gone cold, and that cold had reached inside me and taken hold of something I had not known was there until it started to freeze. I found the letters by accident. Or perhaps not entirely by accident. I had begun, in those weeks of cold and distance, to watch Mira with the same careful attention I had once directed at the estate's rhythms. She was visiting frequently. She was cultivating. I could see it in the way she positioned herself at social occasions, always at the edge of the Alpha's peripheral vision, always available to be consulted, to be believed, to be the voice in the room offering concerned and reluctant information about someone who could not defend herself because she did not know she was being accused. It was Dorian Vass's study that gave me the thread. Mira had been careless, not much, but enough. A copy of one letter left in a correspondence she had asked Dorian to forward, tucked between two legitimate documents I had been sent to retrieve for the estate steward. Perhaps she had not expected me to read it. Perhaps she had simply stopped thinking of me as someone who noticed things. That was her error. I read it once. Twice. A third time. And then I sat very still for a long moment in Dorian Vass's empty study, with the letter in my hands and the fire burning low in the grate, and I felt something move through me that was not grief and not anger and not the desperate, wounded confusion of the past weeks. It was cold. Absolute and clarifying, like stepping outside in January. I had been here before, in a sense. Standing in a room, understanding what someone had done to me, feeling the shape of the betrayal before I fully had words for it. My stepmother's voice saying my name. Myra's hand pressed flat against the wall. The same family. The same architecture of sacrifice. I did not cry. There was nothing in me that wanted to cry. What was in me was something harder and quieter and far more purposeful. I traced the rest within 48 hours. A conversation reconstructed here, a discrepancy in dates there, the handwriting examined against every sample of Myra's correspondence I could locate in the estate's social records. By the time I was finished, I had enough. I went to Kael's study. I did not request an audience. I did not go through Mrs. Calloway or the estate steward or any of the formal channels that a debt servant was meant to use when seeking the Alpha's attention. I walked to his study door and I knocked twice, and when his voice came from within, "Enter," I opened the door and walked in and closed it behind me and stood in front of his desk and looked at him directly. He looked up from his work. Something moved across his face, quickly contained, but I saw it. Something that was not indifference. Something closer to pain, if powerful men in dark studies allowed themselves such things. I set the letters on his desk. Not the forgeries. Those would come. First, my own reconstruction. The dates. The discrepancies. The handwriting analysis. The account of where Mira had been and when, and what it corresponded to in the timeline of his withdrawal. He read it in silence. I stood and I watched him read, and I kept my hands still at my sides and I breathed steadily, and I did not let a single thing I was feeling reach my face, because I had learned from the very best. From months in a house that specialized in performing one thing while being another, how to hold yourself together with sheer architectural will. When he set the papers down, he did not look at me immediately. He looked at the desk. And in that moment I saw it, the thing I had seen at the stone wall on the night that changed everything. The crack. The weight of being wrong about something that mattered. I spoke before he could. "You believed her over me," I said. My voice was even. Precise. The voice of someone who has decided to say the true thing regardless of what it costs. "You had letters," he said. It was not a defense. It was barely an explanation. He seemed to know it. "You had 7 months of evidence that I was not what those letters claimed," I said. "You had the charter. You had the hall. You had every dawn in the library and every night at the wall, and when someone placed a different story in front of you. A story that let you retreat, that let you go back behind the wall where it was safer, you chose it. A silence. You chose the easier story, I said. Because the other one was more frightening. He stood. The movement was not aggressive, it was the movement of a man who could no longer remain seated with what he was feeling, which was its own kind of confession. Selene. I came here as a debt, I said. I have worked every day to be something more than that in my own estimation, because no one else was going to do it for me. I did not ask you to see me. I did not ask you to trust me. And I certainly did not ask you to make me feel as though I was worth seeing and then decide I was not. I picked up my documents and turned toward the door. His hand closed around my wrist. Not hard. Not restraining. Just present. Warm and certain, and the first time in the 8 months I had lived in this estate that he had touched me. I stopped. I did not turn around. Don't, he said. One word. Rough at the edges, like something that had been held too long before being released. Almost broken. Not a command. Nothing as simple as a command. A plea. I stood at the door with his hand around my wrist and the fire burning behind us and 8 months of everything compressed into the silence between that word and whatever came next. I did not leave. Not yet. But I did not turn around either. Because I had learned, in this house and before it, that the moment you turn back is the moment you hand someone the map of everything that can still hurt you. And I was not ready. Not yet. Lyra Ashvane had been watching. That was the thing about Lyra, she was always watching, always calculating, always reading the room for the slightest variation in the distribution of power. She had watched Kael's coldness toward me develop over the preceding weeks with a particular satisfaction she had not quite managed to keep off her face. And she had watched its sudden absence, in the hours following my visit to his study, with an expression entirely different. She moved the next morning. I learned afterward that she had sent word to the senior pack members the previous evening, a formal request for a pack assembly, citing a matter of urgent importance to the Alpha's household. It was her right, as his betrothed, to make such a request. It was a right she had clearly been saving for precisely this moment. The assembly convened in the great hall at mid-morning. I was not summoned. I was not meant to be there. But Mrs. Calloway found me in the east corridor with an expression that was as close to alarm as that composed woman ever permitted herself, and she said only, "You should come," and I followed her without asking why. The hall was full. Every senior pack member. Every elder. Several of the regional allies who had attended the winter gala and had not yet departed. Dorian Vass, near the back, with the expression of a man who had begun to understand that his association with Mira Voss was a more complicated investment than he had anticipated. And Lyra, at the front. She had dressed for this. There was no other explanation for it, the severity of her gown, the precision of her hair, the stillness with which she stood before the assembly like someone who had rehearsed this moment and found it finally, satisfyingly arrived. She spoke with controlled fury dressed as controlled dignity. About the sanctity of the Alpha's betrothal. About the corruption of the household from within. About a debt servant, her voice sharpened precisely on those 2 words, extracting every drop of diminishment available in them, who had used proximity and manipulation to insert herself into the Alpha's confidence. Who had enchanted and deceived and undermined a sacred arrangement that predated her arrival and would outlast it. She was eloquent. She was devastating. She was, I realized, burning her bridge with architectural precision because she believed she was standing on solid ground. The hall was utterly silent. I stood near the back and I did not move and I did not speak and I kept my eyes on Kael. He was at the front of the hall, slightly to the side, and he had let her speak without interruption, which I had taken, for one terrible moment, as permission. As agreement. As the final, formal version of the easier story. Then she finished. And Kael turned to face the assembly. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone who has already decided and is simply finding the right words for what the decision requires. The betrothal, he said, is dissolved. 3 words. The hall did not react immediately. It absorbed the words the way stone absorbs water, slowly, disbelievingly, and then all at once. Lyra's face did something I had never seen it do. Something underneath the perfect surface gave way, not dramatically, not in the fashion of someone performing grief. Worse than that. The face of someone who had genuinely not believed this was possible. Who had calculated every variable and not included this one. You cannot, she began. It is done, Kael said. The same quiet. The same absolute finality. He turned. He walked across the hall. Through the assembly, which parted. Not because they were instructed to, but because that is what people do when something with that kind of gravity moves through a space. He stopped in front of me. In front of everyone. In the hall where I had once stood accused of theft, chin up, alone against the whole gathered weight of the pack. In the hall where I had been the debt girl, the East Corridor room, the nothing that 2 young men laughed about through thin walls. He looked at me. And he said, quietly, so that the front of the hall might not have heard it, but the people nearest to us certainly did. You are not a debt. You never were. The silence in that hall was the most complete thing I have ever stood inside. Behind him, Lyra Ashvane walked out. Her attendants followed. Her footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound in the room, precise, contained, and then gone. I stood and looked at Kael Ironblood, and I thought about the carriage, and the rain, and my name in my stepmother's mouth, and the East Corridor room, and every morning I had told myself I would not break. I thought, so this is what it feels like when something finally does not break you. I handled Mira myself. I want to be clear about that. Not out of pride, or not only. But because it mattered to me that this particular reckoning not belong to anyone else. It had been done to me. The undoing of it was mine. I brought the evidence before the pack elders that same afternoon. Not to Kael. To the elders. The formal judicial body of the pack, the ones whose authority existed independent of the Alpha's personal feelings on any matter, which meant their verdict could not be questioned or softened on grounds of sentiment. I presented the forged letters alongside my analysis. The handwriting comparison. The timeline. The testimony of 2 household staff who had observed Myra's private movements on the relevant dates, whose accounts I had collected quietly over the preceding days with the same patient, precise attention I had brought to everything else in this estate. I presented it the way I had corrected the land charter. Carefully. Completely. Without drama and without heat. The elders deliberated for less time than I expected. The verdict was formal and it was final. Mira Voss, found to have engaged in deliberate deception against a member of the Alpha's household and the integrity of the pack's internal affairs, was removed from all pack affiliation, which meant every social connection she had cultivated through the Ironblood orbit, every alliance she had positioned herself within, every rung of the climb she had been making since the night she pressed her hand against the wall and breathed out in relief, gone. Severed cleanly. My father, as the head of the household from which the deception had originated, was formally included in the removal. I stood in the elder's chamber and I listened to it pronounced, and I thought about my father and his good brown coat on the night of the rain. The manila envelope. It is only 3 years. The look on his face that was apologetic and uncomfortable, but not the look of a man about to change his mind. I did not feel, in that moment, what I thought I would feel. I had imagined, in the rare hours when I allowed myself to imagine it, that the reckoning would feel like fire. Like the release of something hot and long compressed, finally given room to expand. It did not feel like that. It felt like the morning after a long illness. Quiet, and clear, and very still. The particular piece of a body that has finished fighting something and finds itself, with some surprise, intact. I stood at the top of the estate steps and I watched their carriage move down the drive, my father's carriage, smaller than the Ironblood vehicles, mud-splashed, the horse tired, and I watched it pass through the gate and I watched the gate close behind it. Mira did not look back. She never had. That was the thing about Mira. She only ever looked forward, toward the next available handhold, the next rung, the next person whose safety she could stand on while her own feet left the ground. She would find another surface to climb. I had no doubt of that. But it would not be here. And it would not be me. I stood at the top of those steps in the cold afternoon air, and I breathed in and I breathed out, and I thought about the girl who had arrived at this gate 8 months ago with a single bag and a cracked library card and a tin of dried lavender, and the cold, fierce, necessary conviction that she would not break. I looked at the gate. I looked at the estate behind me, its stone and its iron and its height, the windows that now held meaning for me, the corridors I knew by memory, the library at dawn, the wall at night, the hall where my name had been spoken in front of everyone by the most powerful man in this region as something other than a debt. And I thought, I did not break. I did not break, and they are gone, and I am still here. This is what closure feels like. Not fire. Not triumph. Just this. Standing on your own ground. Knowing precisely what you survived to get here. And being, for the first time in longer than you can remember, entirely unafraid of what comes next. I was at the wall when he found me. The same wall. The same spot where I had once stood beside him in the dark and talked about nothing of consequence, and felt, for the first time since the carriage and the rain and my father's good brown coat, that I was somewhere I might be allowed to simply exist. I had not gone there looking for anything. I had gone because the estate was full of the aftermath of everything that had happened. The assembly, the elders, the carriage moving down the drive, and the inside of my own head was louder than I knew how to quiet, and the wall and the forest and the cold air had always been the place where things settled. I heard his footsteps on the frost-hardened ground before I saw him. He came and stood beside me. Not across from me, not at a formal distance. Beside me, the way he had that first night. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, which was a thing I had not allowed myself to notice then and was finding it difficult not to notice now. He did not ask permission. He simply sat, lowering himself onto the top of the low stone wall beside me, forearms resting on his knees, looking out at the dark tree line the same way he always looked at things that mattered, directly, without flinching from what was there. Neither of us spoke for a while. The owl called again, further away now. And then Kael said, quietly, into the dark. I don't know how to undo what I did. Not an excuse. Not an explanation dressed as an apology. Just, the true thing, said plainly, with the particular difficulty of a man who has spent his entire life being certain and has arrived somewhere he is not. I looked out at the forest. You can't, I said. A silence. He absorbed it without deflecting. But, I said. And I felt something shift in me as I said it, something that had been braced against him for weeks beginning, slowly, to release. You can start from here. He turned to look at me then. And in the moonlight, with the frost on the ground and the forest beyond and the estate behind us, his face was the most unguarded I had ever seen it. All the architecture of authority and distance and careful control, still there, but moved aside. Like a curtain drawn back from a window that had been covered for a very long time. He spoke. Not carefully, not with the measured precision of the man in the dark study surrounded by ledgers and maps. He spoke the way people speak when they have decided that the cost of not speaking is finally higher than the cost of being known. He told me he had noticed me on the first night. Not seen, noticed. That there was a difference, and that the difference had unsettled him from the beginning. That he had watched the enforcer take my bag and watched my father's hand complete the exchange and watched me stand in the rain in the yard, and he had told himself I was a transaction and walked away, and that the walking away had required more deliberate effort than it should have. He told me that the mornings in the library, the evenings at the wall, he had not stumbled into them. He had chosen them. Had told himself, each time, that he was simply keeping account of a household member, monitoring the debt arrangement, nothing more. Had believed it with decreasing conviction over an increasing number of mornings. He told me that when the coldness came, when Myra's letters had given him the architecture of a retreat, the thing that had convinced him was not the evidence itself. It was the relief. The terrible, cowardly relief of having a reason to step back from something that frightened him. From someone who had arrived in his house as a debt receipt and had somehow, without asking permission, made herself necessary to the texture of his days. Her absence during his coldness felt like a missing piece. He said it simply. Without decoration. I knew something was wrong with me, he said. Within a week. I knew the shape of what I'd lost and I told myself it was better this way. That you would leave at the end of your 3 years and it was better not to have built something that would then be absent. That was not your decision to make, I said. No, he said. It wasn't. A silence. Long and honest and held between us like something fragile we had both decided to be careful with. Choosing to believe those letters, he said finally, was the most cowardly thing I have ever done. And I have made hard decisions in this role that I will carry the rest of my life. But that one, he stopped. Looked at his hands. That one I am most ashamed of. I looked at him for a long moment. At the scar along his jaw. At the hands that ran a pack and signed documents and had closed, warm and certain, around my wrist in a doorway, and said don't in a voice that had nothing of command in it. At the face of a man who had looked through me on the first night and learned, over 8 months, to look at me instead. Then be ashamed of it, I said. And do not do it again. He held my gaze. And something between us, that unnamed thing, that careful and unspoken and long-circling thing, settled. Quietly. Without fanfare. The way 2 rivers that have been running close to each other for a long time finally stop pretending they are not moving in the same direction. In the old pack tradition, the Alpha's choosing of a mate is not a private matter. It cannot be. The Alpha's bond is not simply a personal declaration, it is a structural one. It speaks to the future of the pack, to bloodline and alliance and the long continuity of everything the pack is built upon. It is announced before the assembled members with full formality. Witnessed. Recorded. Made permanent in the collective memory of every person present. It is not a quiet thing. I did not know it was coming. 3 days after the wall. 3 days of something new and tentative and careful growing in the space that the old distance had left behind. 3 days of relearning how to be near each other without the armor we had both been wearing so long we had forgotten it was there. Kael called the pack assembly at noon. I was in the library when Mrs. Calloway found me, and this time her expression was not alarm. It was something I had never seen on her composed and careful face before. Something that was, if I was reading it correctly, the precise equivalent of trying very hard not to smile. The Alpha requests your presence in the Great Hall, she said. The hall was full. Every pack member. Every elder. Staff and allies and senior household. The same hall where I had stood accused and alone and kept my chin up through sheer architectural will. The same stone floor. The same torches in their iron brackets. The same high ceiling that swallowed sound and returned it changed. I walked in and every face turned, and I understood, from the quality of the silence, from the way people moved slightly to clear a path without being asked, that they already knew what this was. That Kael had not told them the specific content of the assembly, but that they knew their Alpha, and they had read the signs, and they had come prepared for something that did not happen very often in a generation. Kael stood at the front of the hall. In his formal coat, deep charcoal, silver at the collar, the kind of thing he wore for occasions that required the full weight of what he was. He stood straight and still and he watched me walk the length of the hall toward him and his face was, not soft, Kael's face was never soft, but open. Open in the way I had seen it at the wall and nowhere else. Like the curtain fully drawn back. Like a man who had decided, completely and without reservation, to be seen. I stopped in front of him. He turned to face the assembled pack. And Kael Ironblood. Alpha of the Ironblood pack, the most powerful man in this region, the one that other powerful men crossed the street to avoid, spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that stone hall without effort, because it was the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. She came here in debt, he said. The hall was so quiet I could hear the torches breathe. She leaves as my equal. My chosen. A pause. 1 beat. 2. My bride. The silence held for one long, suspended moment, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, that is not the absence of sound but the presence of something too large for sound to contain. And then, one elder, at the front. He lowered his head. Slowly. Deliberately. The bow of a man who has seen many things in his long years of service and has decided that this one is worthy of the oldest gesture of respect the pack tradition holds. Then the man beside him. Then the next. One by one, like candles being lit from a single flame, moving through the assembled pack from front to back, heads lowering. Not to the floor. Not in submission. The specific inclination of equals acknowledging something they recognize as true. The debt girl. The East Corridor room. The nothing that 2 young men laughed about through thin walls. Standing at the front of this hall, beside this man, being witnessed by every person who had ever looked through her or past her or at her with the particular comfortable dismissal of people who have decided in advance what something is worth. I stood straight. I kept my chin up, not from defiance this time, but from something that did not have a name yet but felt, in every bone of me, like its rightful opposite. There is a particular hour in the evening, when the torches have been lit and the light they make is gold against the stone walls, and the estate exhales from the business of the day into something quieter. I have learned to love that hour. I stand sometimes at the top of the main staircase, not to go anywhere, just to stand, and I look down at the hall below. The high ceiling. The iron brackets. The floors I once scrubbed on my hands and knees in the gray hours before anyone was awake, with my hair pinned back and my hands reddened from cold water, listening to the estate begin to breathe. I stood in those floors. I learned their cold and their silence and their indifference, and I carried it, and I did not put it down until I had earned the right to set it somewhere that was mine. I think sometimes about my father's face on the night of the rain. The carriage lamp above his head. The envelope in his hands. The way he looked at me, that particular look that was almost sorry, was almost enough, was almost the look of a man who might yet change his mind. I have stopped being angry at him. Not because he deserves the absence of my anger. But because anger is a thing you carry, and I have decided, very deliberately, what I will and will not carry from here. I think about Myra's hand pressed flat against the wall. The exhale she could not quite hide. I think about the East Corridor room with its narrow bed and its single window looking onto the kitchen yard, and the first morning I stood at that window and looked at the mud and the stone walls and made myself the only promise I have never broken. I will not break. Not here. Not for them. I kept it. I want you to understand what that means. Not as triumph, not as the ending of a story where justice arrives and everything is made symmetrical and right. Real life is not symmetrical. Real justice does not balance every scale. What it means is this. They handed me over in the rain like I was a number in a ledger. They assumed that what I was on that night was the fixed and final version of me, that the girl with one bag and a cracked library card and a tin of lavender was the ceiling of what I would ever be. They were wrong. Not because I was extraordinary. Not because I was chosen, or special, or destined for something that set me apart from every other girl handed over in the rain on a dark night by a man in a good brown coat. But because I was paying attention. Because I was patient. Because I took the only currency available to me, observation, knowledge, endurance, the slow and steady accumulation of understanding, and I spent it carefully, and I did not waste a single coin of it on bitterness. Kael finds me sometimes in that hour, at the top of the staircase, looking down at the hall. He stands beside me without asking, the way he has always done the things that matter, without ceremony, without announcement. Just present. Warm against the evening air. He does not ask what I am thinking about. He already knows, I think. Or he understands the shape of it, which is close enough. I did not come here to be saved. I did not come here to fall in love, or to become anything other than a girl getting through 3 years with her dignity intact and herself still recognizably her own. But I came here in a rainstorm as a debt. And I am standing now in the torchlight of a home that is mine, beside a man who looked through me once and has spent every day since learning to look properly, in a hall that has heard my name spoken as something worth speaking. And I did not forgive what was done to me. I did not need to. I simply. 1. They sold me to settle a debt. They thought they were erasing me. But every cold morning and every silent corridor and every name I was not called, I used. I kept. I built from. And the man they handed me to? He didn't just free me from the debt. He chose me. When no one else ever had. Hold it as a reminder. Not of a fairy tale. Not of a world that does not exist. But of something true, something that has always been true, long before stories were written down or told aloud or carried across generations in the mouths of people who needed to believe it. That what is done to you is not the final word on who you are. That the people who reduce you to a number, a burden, a convenient sacrifice, they do not get to author your ending. They only get to write the first page. What comes after belongs entirely to you. To the quiet, daily, unglamorous decision to keep going. To keep learning. To keep your chin up in the halls where they expect you to break. Selene did not win because she was chosen. She was chosen because she refused, in the rain, in the corridor, in the cold east room where nobody learned her name. She refused to become what they needed her to be in order to feel better about what they had done. That is the whole of it. That is the moral of every story ever told about a woman who started at the bottom of someone else's decision and ended up standing at the top of her own life. You do not bend to the shape of what they think you are. That decision, made alone, made quietly, made on the worst night with nothing but your own unbroken will for company. That is where everything begins. And to every single one of you who sat with this story today. Who rode with Selene through the rain and the corridor and the cold hall and the wall at night and the long, patient work of becoming. Thank you. Not a small thank you. Not a formal one. A real one. Because you did not have to be here. You chose this. You chose to spend your time in this world, with this story, with this voice, and that choice is not something I take lightly or for granted, not for a single second. This community. The people who show up, who listen all the way to the end, who leave a comment and come back for the next amazing stories and bring someone else with them because they wanted to share something that moved them. You are why these stories exist. Not the algorithm. Not the numbers. You. So from the very bottom of wherever good stories come from. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being exactly the kind of person who roots for a girl in the rain.